wrong thing? Where do I need to aim it?
I will mess with that for you.
All right, well, you know, a lot of you are probably already familiar with the Clean Water Act of 1972, federal legislation. And 402 is what you call your wastewater discharge permit program. And all the states, most of the states, and I don't know, a couple of the tribes, I look at her, she has a lot of tribal work too, implement that themselves. And that is your pollution permits for your industrial activities, and they also do stormwater permits for construction activities and things like that. And that's implemented at the state level. Section 404 is related, and it says that it prohibits the discharge of dredged or filled material in navigable waters, which are defined under the Act as waters of the United States. But that term is not defined in the Act, and that's one of the big problems, is because even though navigable waters is defined as waters of the United States, and clearly then they're not the same thing, the Act doesn't bother to actually define that term itself. But discharge of dredged or filled material in navigable waters, or waters of the United States, it talks about discharge, but essentially that means wetland alteration. Alteration in wetlands, and that has been defined, as we'll talk about, some wetlands, not all wetlands, some waters, not all waters. And that's been the ping pong match since the 80s, and we'll talk more about that. But again, the Army Corps of Engineers implements the program unless it's a state has taken over it, and that's been a lot fewer states, and we'll talk about that. The 404 assumption process, currently there are only 2 states that have that authority. Florida had it and doesn't currently, and that's on appeal, and we'll talk about that. But, so right now in the state of Florida, the Corps is issuing those permits again. There were 4 years there where they weren't, and it was a state. And they issue those permits, and they can be individual permits, general permits, what they call nationwide permits, regional general permits. There's a state programmatic general permit. The general permits are when the activities are certain specified activities they've decided in advance have a lower impact to navigable waters of the United States than the individual permits, which are like your more intensive projects or your larger projects. Mostly the general permit threshold is half an acre of impacts to wetlands or surface waters or less as a general rule. And you get those permits if you satisfy what they call the 404B1 guidelines. We're not going to get into this. This is not permitting 101. We can talk about it if you have questions at the end. But it's a series of guidelines that you have to walk through for the ultimate goal of no unmitigated adverse impacts to the waters of the United States. And then the Corps has their own rules onto it that require balancing of public interest criteria and a variety of things. We have to walk through those. And sometimes the project will be positive in that regard, and sometimes it'll be negative because they're not all environmentally related criteria. At the state level, all of the public interest criteria are water resource related. At the federal level, it's a variety, and it's a balancing act. And the EPA has a role too, and they ultimately have the ultimate authority to what they call veto a permit, add conditions, they can comment on it, and it's a limited use of their veto power to veto a permit. They've only exercised it like 22 times in the entire history of the Act. So all of that is the regulatory framework that we're setting up here to talk about kind of what's happening now. So I'm going to turn it over to Victoria to talk about that concept of waters of the United States and what's commonly understood and then what's not so commonly understood about that term.
Hi. So as you can see on this slide, this is the traditional navigable waters. And so this is not what we are discussing today. These oceans and anything navigable to another jurisdictional water body has always been protected. What we're talking about today is some intermittent and ethereal streams, perennial, that may have jurisdiction as well. So these type of waters have been protected, but the nuances are the other types of wetlands, and are they connected through proximity factor or adjacent wetlands or whatever it might be.
And just looking at that last little category here on the sign there, that water use for interstate commerce, that was the hook in the early 80s. We'll talk about in a minute before we turn to the next slide. That was the hook in the rules in the 86 and 88 that brought in all of the other wetlands. What is a water that's used in interstate commerce? There's a case about if migratory birds are using this mine pit, this old reclaimed mine pit, is that enough of a hook to interstate commerce or not? So the rules in the 80s just said everything else is susceptible for use in interstate commerce. And that's where we had a lot of the court cases all came out. And I'm not even talking about all the stuff that came up before the Supreme Court case in Rapanos. But that was what they were dealing with. They were dealing with rules in the 80s that defined those traditionally navigable waters, the tidal waters, the territorial seas, and then they said, and everything else that has an effect on interstate commerce, and with some examples. And that's where all the litigation has been. There's been some on the edges on some of those other categories about what is or is not susceptible to navigate to use of navigation. But largely it's been this last little category of interstate commerce, and that's again a regulatory. And so, we won't get all the case law up to that point. But in 2015, the Supreme Court looked in the case of Rapanos, and full, you can look up the full court case name. They decided they were looking at those rules and they were comparing it to the term waters of the United States is used in the Clean Water Act. And they said you've gone too far in what you consider a jurisdictional wetland. When is a wetland jurisdictional? Everybody had agreed that there are certain wetlands that if they have a close enough connection to another water of the United States, another category, whether it's that territorial sea or it's a tributary to a river, like the Mississippi River or something like that, there was always agreement that some category of wetlands was jurisdictional. But so what they came down with was the plurality decision said there has to be a continuous surface connection between another category, like a river, a tributary, like a stream or a river, or the sea itself. There has to be some continuous surface connection between the wetland and this other thing, this lake or something. And the concurrence, Justice Kennedy said, well, we think it's something, more or less. It's like, he said there has to be some sort of hydrologic, ecologic, biologic significant nexus between the wetland and these other jurisdictional waters. And because of the oddities of Supreme Court jurisdiction, the plurality opinion was considered the common basis for everything. And so then we started getting rules that were debating, is it that continuous surface connection rule or is it the significant nexus rule? In the Obama administration, they came out with a clean water rule that said, and everybody, the agencies, EPA and the Corps, had developed rules, or guidance, I should say. They hadn't done rulemaking yet, that said significant nexus. They used both tests. They said if it's got either of those things, it's jurisdictional. So it was an expansive view of jurisdiction. And the Obama administration came out with a clean water rule in 2015 that took the same approach as that was in their guidance. They said they're using both tests and claiming jurisdiction over wetlands and tributaries, the streams, even if they were ephemeral, or were actually usually not ephemeral, but if they were intermittent, had intermittent flow, they didn't, they would still be jurisdictional if they had a significant nexus. And they looked at it collectively in the region. Are all of the wetlands, in this same sub-watershed, do they have a significant nexus collectively, recognizing that things are interrelated? Well, then the first Trump administration came along. The first thing they did was repeal the rule, which sent us back to the rules of the 80s and back to the plus Rapanos. And so it sent us back to this honestly the same thing, because the significant nexus was the rule of the land anyway. And then they came up with the Navigable Waters Protection Rule that took out significant nexus, just kept continuous surface connection, but they kept it in a way that was kind of familiar with some of the rules they had in place at the time as to the definition of what is an adjacent wetland. Did allow for connections via culverts and pipes and things like that, as long as it was fairly close, and it was there wasn't a physical land separation obstructing the connection. And then that never went into effect in Florida, and because of rule challenges. But the Navigable Water Protection Rule was the rule that was the Navigable Water Protection Rule went in effect in Florida. The Clean Water Rule never did. And then that rule was a rule that was in place when Florida sought and got the State 404 program, which led to even more dispute and complaint. And then we came to the 2023 rule in the Biden administration that put it back in. They essentially restored the Obama administration rule and said, yes, it is going to be both tests again. They did a little bit of trimming around the edges, but generally it was the same rule back again. And again, that litigation injunctions in place, that rule never went into effect in Florida too. And so we're like, again, what the heck are we supposed to do in Florida? What rule applies? What is jurisdictional? What is not? It was particularly complicated when you talk about the State 404 program, because the rules changed in the middle of the game. While the state of Florida had the program, the definition changed in the middle of it. Because again, the rule, because the navigable water rule had been suspended, declared, replaced by the 2023 rule, we were sent back to the mid-80s again in terms of that rule under Rapanos. Then
Sackett comes along. So Sackett is a case involving two Idaho property owners, Michael and Chantal Sackett, who wanted to build a lake house on their property in Priest Lake, Idaho. Their property, it was separated from Priest Lake by, you'll see on the screen, this creek, an unnamed tributary, and a road. The unnamed tributary is just a roadside ditch. So the Sacketts started building on their property. They started filling in the wetlands on their property, and the EPA quickly brought an enforcement action saying you need a permit to be able to fill in these wetlands because your wetlands are jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. So the EPA acknowledged because of that road, there was no surface connection between Priest Lake and the Sackett's property. However, the EPA was claiming jurisdiction based on, as Susan mentioned, the significant nexus standard from Justice Kennedy's concurrence in Rapanos. So the litigation was occurring for years and years and years. Eventually, it made it up to the Supreme Court in 2023, and the court decided the case in May of 2023. The roadside ditch was not at issue in the case, which could have, if the court had considered whether or not the roadside ditch was jurisdictional, we'd have a little more indication as to what does relatively permanent waters mean, which is a form of the water of the United States. However, the court just focused on whether or not the wetlands on the Sackett's property were jurisdictional. So what did the court decide? Actually, all 9 justices on the court agreed that the Sackett wetlands were not jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. It was just the test of what waters are jurisdictional that the justices disagreed on. The majority of the court essentially followed Justice Scalia's plurality decision that Susan just mentioned in Rapanos, and found that the term navigable waters, as used in section 404G of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Water Act in general, in the plural has meaning, and that you have to consider a wetland in relation to a relatively permanent water. and they determined that only wetlands that are indistinguishable as a practical matter from waters of the United States are considered jurisdictional. And to meet that standard, the court said that the wetland needs to have a continuous surface connection with a relatively permanent water that is connected to a traditionally navigable water. And that continuous surface connection makes it difficult to determine where the wetland ends and the water begins. Also, the court dropped a footnote in the case and said that a person cannot sever jurisdiction between a wetland and a relatively permanent water by illegally constructing a barrier such as a dune or a dike or a berm and exclude themselves from jurisdiction. So they kind of tried to address that potential loophole that someone might be thinking of. So also importantly, the court, while it didn't address that roadside ditch that I just talked about, it did provide this language in the decision. It said that the Clean Water Act's use of the term waters encompasses only those relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing bodies of water that are described in ordinary parlance as streams, oceans, rivers, and lakes. So Susan will get into a little bit of what meaning that language from the case has and how it's been being interpreted by lower courts. But first, Victoria, could you provide a little bit of insight as to what permittees and the regulated public's reaction to the Sackett decision was?
Yes. So as you can see, it's highly ambiguous. And environmental consultants were having trouble even figuring out which is jurisdictional or not. And so it created a lot of confusion with landowners because we need to know, do we need a federal permit or not? And it was going through this process, a long, timely, and costly process just to determine if you needed it. And so the significant nexus and the proximity factor and all these different things created such confusion that the way things are now, we might not be regulating as many wetlands, but at least the common folk and a prestigious attorney or environmental consultant knows what they're doing. And so the significant nexus test was highly ambiguity. It didn't have any standards. It didn't say, 300 feet or 700 feet. It just said, it needs to be nearby. It needs to figure out if it was adjacent or if it was isolated. And so isolated wetlands here in Florida will be regulated from DEP, no problem. And thank God we live in Florida, and so all isolated wetlands will be regulated as well, no problem. But on the federal side and in other parts of the state, this will dramatically affect what is being regulated and what is not, for good or for bad. And so this confusing rule that goes back and forth every few years, we've got to try to understand it so that when it goes back again, hopefully not, but maybe it probably will, we understand what exactly we're doing here, what is going to be jurisdictional. And it's when I first started this industry, it was very, very clear. It was a navigable water, you need a federal permit, and if it's an isolated wetland, you don't. But now, an isolated wetland kind of, we're blur the lines. And so there was a lot of confusion.
All right, so going back to this chart you saw again with a little bit more, added to it, is where are we in Florida relative to all of this case law and all of the rules? Well, the conforming rule was what the Biden administration did to its 2023 rule after the Sackett decision came out. And what they did was basically fairly surgical excising of the term significant nexus. They just took all of that concept and that definition out. and then they took the word adjacent and defined adjacent as continuous surface connection, period. They didn't change any of their preamble language relative to what is a relatively permanent water, what does that mean? They have a lot in there about looking at antecedent flow conditions, still quite a lot of scientific evaluation as to whether something is a relatively permanent water or not. And by that I'm talking the streams. And they did not address the issue of is this relatively permanent water a water body in the ordinary course, because all of their jurisdictional determinations, they do use ditches. Is it a perennial ditch? Is it an intermittent ditch, or is it an ephemeral ditch? Is the ditch cut in uplands, or is it cut in wetlands? None of that was in the Sackett decision. They said if it's a tributary, it's relatively permanent water, or it's standing, it's got to have water in it most of the time, except in cases of extreme drought. Or unusual temporary interruptions or illegal interruptions of somebody digging a ditch. So the 2023 rule didn't do that, and the conforming rule didn't do that either. They just pointed back to the original. They had no new preamble. They just did those two very precise changes, so that they didn't have to go through full rulemaking again, and they just issued it as a final rule. That was immediately challenged, of course, by the same states that challenged the 2023 rule. That, again, and because Florida was involved in that challenge, that rule doesn't apply in Florida. As you'll see, it doesn't really matter. The EPA and the Corps are applying the same test regardless of where you are, whether the rule applies or doesn't apply, they're doing the same thing. So. As a practical matter, the same decisions are being made by the agencies everywhere, and the courts don't really like this either. The courts are like, you can't, you're saying you're applying Sackett, they're saying we're going back to the rules that were in place prior to 2015 plus Sackett. That's kind of confusing. So that's what the agencies are doing in Florida right now. That's what they purport to be doing, but as a practical matter, you'll see the jurisdictional determinations that are coming out, it's all, because they're applying how they interpret Sackett, they're using their pre-2015 guidance to look at how they determine whether something's relatively permanent, how far the wetlands might go, what kind of things they might look at, but they're generally coming out with the same decisions regardless of state.
Now this map is pretty alarming. I saw this last week when I attended a webinar by Royal Gardner, Stetson Law, and he had this slide, and so I emailed him and I said, I need that slide. And basically, as you can see, is that all the regulated wetlands on the left, free, and now what we're looking at, which really restricts federal regulation. Now, on a mitigation banking standpoint, now we have state and federal credits. Our federal credits are less desirable. But at the same time, our applicants are able to figure out what they need to do, because permitting, takes so long anyways. But to figure out if you have a permit, just to add another 100 days, give me a break. So this creates, clarity, which we love, but it does remove a lot of jurisdiction by the court. And like I said before, in Florida we're safe because we still have regulations with DEP, but in other parts of the country we don't. And so I know that the goal is to move a lot of these federal regulations to the state, not just in Florida, but throughout the country. Give the power to the state so that we can decide and regulate what needs to be regulated or not. And so this slide is quite alarming, but as you can see, it's around the traditional navigable waters, the east and the west coast of Florida. And so this slide is very important to understand the significance of these decisions.
And I would say, just looking at that figure, it's like there could be, again, these are based on National Wetlands Inventory mapping. So as if you're familiar with that at all, you know that that's not exactly the most accurate representation of whether there is or is not a wetland on your property. So there very well could be additional wetlands that are like adjacent to the streams, the blue, obviously we all recognize like Okeechobee there. This is just southern Florida. This is not all Florida, as you can also recognize. But the Everglades are still going to be the Everglades. I still think, I don't know that that's going to be the full, the full picture. This is not based on a formal determination by any of the agencies or even a court. This is just an evaluation of trying to apply that test and say, okay, what does it say? And again, it can be quite confusing. And so that leaves us again with a bunch of questions that are kind of being answered by the courts. The agencies are taking their own view, and by agencies I mean the Corps of Engineers and EPA. And the courts are starting to weigh in at the federal court, and they're saying a variety of things, mostly that they think that the agencies are going too far, some are doing the opposite. But what is relatively permanent water to make a stream or a river, it's a river generally, if it's navigable, it's going to be jurisdictional, or if it used to be navigable, it's going to be jurisdictional. But if it's has flow a lot less frequently, what is that level of frequency, and how do you have to go prove it, right? What sort of test do you have to do? Because do you need a flow meter? Do you need flow data? So it can be confusing. And then what about this geographic features? The courts are some courts saying, yeah, that means a stream, not a ditch. Doesn't mean a canal. Well, a canal's navigable, so that might that's going to check that box separately if it's navigable. We have a lot of canals in Florida. Are they relatively permanent? Most of the courts have not really come down very clearly on that, except to say if it's not relatively permanent, it's not going to be jurisdictional. But we have one in Florida that did come down and be a little bit more definitive on that. And then that practically just indistinguishable language, how important is that? It sounds pretty important. EPA and the Corps don't think it's important at all, and there's a court decision that also says it's not important at all. The Biden rule doesn't say it's important at all. The Biden rule doesn't use that word in its definition. It just says continuous service connection. So that's still another area in dispute, as obviously that changes, and I'll explain a little bit about how they're interpreting that concept. They're kind of using NPDES concepts here in the 404 context. But we'll talk about that, but first I did want to kind of talk about that relatively permanent flow. What does that mean in turning to our, what do the consultants have to look at when they're looking at flow regimes and what could be in that bucket of relatively permanent waters?
Right, so there's 3 different types of wetlands that we've categorized. The perennial, which means that it's water is standing there during a typical year, all year long, and flowing water, the water table is located above most of the year. And then there's intermittent, which is flowing sometimes of the year. The groundwater provides water for stream flow. During dry periods, they won't have flowing water, mostly from precipitation. And so are these intermittent wetlands jurisdictional? Streams are still, unclear. And then there's the ethereal, which is only wet a few times a year. And that is what the conforming rule was really overreaching to also have regulation over these streams that aren't wet year long, but maybe 5-10 days a year. And so in other parts of the country, like Texas, mitigation bankers, under the conforming rule, the old rule, they thought they were creating mitigation banks for these inferior wetlands, these ditches and culverts. And then when everything changed, they're out of business. Their whole performa changed. And so looking at it from that kind of perspective, it was a sad day for them because they were banking on providing wetland mitigation for streams that don't flow year round and might just be caused from rainfall. And so such unclear guidance, and so perennial is really where we're focusing, and the intermittent is questionable, but the ethereal is out.
So, I'm not gonna go through each case here, but the kind of takeaways from this, the most important to look at from Florida standpoint are the Lewis versus US case, because it's an appellate court decision, and that came out at the end of 2023. This had a kind of follow-up, and a parallel case just came out. The Sharfie decision just came out, the magistrate's opinion came out in September, and the district court judge adopted it in December. And then the Glenn Environmental Coalition case out of Georgia is on appeal to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is binding in Florida, and that is actually set for oral argument in April. So those are the kind of top three I would take a look at, simply because they are more controlling than others in some of the other jurisdictions, but there are some other ones we'll talk about. And the takeaway is, again, one of the things I would like to point out is the distinction that the judges aren't really honing in on how the agencies are making the continuous surface connection case. And so some of these cases, like Glenn Environmental Coalition, they're saying your surface connection, a continuous surface connection versus through ditches and culverts, that's not a continuous surface connection. But they were, in that case, they were kind of far away. There was a road, a ditch, a culvert, another road, and a tidal wetland. And they're like, that's too far away. That's not so close as to be practically indistinguishable. They said that is not close enough. And as we said again, the agencies are, the White case, we'll talk about in a little bit, they said you don't need it to be continuously practically indistinguishable. It just needs a continuous surface connection. So the agencies are saying the connecting point between your wetland and your relatively permanent water, your other WOTUS here, that can be long, it can be a pipe, it can be a ditch. That thing itself does not need to be jurisdictional. As long as there isn't a physical obstruction, there's some indication of flow, and some of the case they'll reject it if it's a weak indication of flow. But they mean like ordinary high water marks and things like that. I'm kind of combining two slides together, but you'll get the point. And they're saying, as long as it's not too far away, and like 725 feet was too far in one case, 325 was close enough. So it's like, again, really kind of squishy, and they've admitted it's very fact dependent. That's what they said. Now the courts have said, this circuitous route, that's not a continuous surface connection so as to be practically indistinguishable. That's not what Sackett meant. If there's a clear demarcation, the agencies were all saying, if it abuts, as in it's right next door, it's okay if there's a little bit of dry land. And the court said no, or like a berm, and there's a court that said no. If there's a clear demarcation, you can tell the difference. They're not flowing together, then that wetland is not going to be jurisdictional. And then they say intermittent flow. A couple courts have said intermittent flow is not enough to make it a relatively permanent body. So that ephemeral, I think everybody's pretty even ephemeral, if it's a relatively permanent water, that's not going to be enough to be relatively permanent to make it a stream itself jurisdictional. Now they're still claiming jurisdiction between the pipe. They don't care if that's ephemeral. That can be ephemeral for the agencies. The courts really haven't honed in on the distinction between relatively permanent water and the connection between the relatively permanent water and the wetland. And that's where the agencies are residing right now. Everyone kind of agreed to make the relatively permanent water jurisdictional. That can't be ephemeral. But the connection between the wetland and the relatively permanent water, that's the big question mark. And the courts are kind of saying, no, it can't be. And the Sharfie case said ditches cannot independently be a water in the United States because that's not a stream. It's not a river. It's not, in the ordinary parlance, what they mean. And they also said relatively permanent doesn't mean ephemeral, it doesn't mean intermittent. But they did leave it open. The Sharfie case and the January case of Lewis did say, leave open the door if it's a seasonally continuous water body. It can be jurisdictional by itself, and I don't mean a connection to a wetland, but the stream can be jurisdictional by itself if it has seasonal flow, at least a few months a year is what the January 25 case said. And so that is, they left it open. They don't, when they say it's not intermittent, they didn't say it has to flow year round. They said if it flows continuously during a season, they didn't say how long, but like during the wet season, if it's always flowing, there's always water in it, that's something that can be claimed itself as a WOTUS. And then the courts on this list did say it really does mean difficult to determine where the water ends and the wetland begins really is important. It really did have meaning. And precisely, they did say, yeah, temporary droughts and presumably tidal influence would also fall into that category. They did allow for that sort of temporary dryness, but it has to be temporarily dry, not frequently dry. Like sporadically is fine, a lot is too, again, that leaves a lot of fuzz around the edges. The last one, again, the White case is an important one, that upheld a challenge to the Biden conforming rule because it didn't have the word practically indistinguishable in it. And so that is what the agencies are looking at. They're saying it doesn't need to be continuous surface connection and practically indistinguishable. If there is a continuous surface connection like that pipe, that powers the test, that makes it practically indistinguishable. And so that's what the Corps and the EPA guidance is coming down, and that's what they're relying on, and they're using that, that's what they argued to the White case, and that's what they're using to go forward. So they have a number of, they look at, is there an unobstructed physical structure through which water flows? Are there indicators of flow in that structure, that ditch, that culvert, whatever that is? If it's not too far, again, what does that mean? Then that connection will make the wetland jurisdictional to that other water that's jurisdictional, even though that connection, weirdly, itself would not be jurisdictional. So you go in there and plow through that connection first without a permit, and then suddenly that wouldn't be jurisdictional. I mean, because that's an odd situation we find ourselves in with that little clarification that they're making, that the courts really haven't responded to in a very articulate fashion yet. So turning that over, now we're back where we are in Florida, and I think now we turn over to, I'm just gonna carry on here. I unfortunately did not put the actual hyperlink language in here, but hopefully if you search these are really, really good tools that EPA has all their, the approved JVs at the EPA site. You can find all of them. They have mapping features, and they have nice little, if time at the end of this, we'll go back and give some examples. That tells you can search by jurisdiction, you can search by, is it a Biden rule state, or is it a pre-2015 state, depending on what. And then in Florida, that Jacksonville district, they actually have their jurisdictional determinations, only the ones that are currently in effect. And so you can actually get the actual document there and take a look and see how these are playing out. Now, surprisingly, of the 79 jurisdictional determinations issued in Florida since SACA came down, only 10 found any waters in the United States. Now, it sounds like, oh no, but I think that was the low-hanging fruit. Taking a look at them, it was like upland type ditches made up a vast majority of the things they found were not jurisdictional. And those had never been jurisdictional before. So I don't think that's really a surprising turn of events. I think they have to send the jurisdictional determinations that for adjacent wetlands, they have to go up to for headquarters review or before they're allowed to release them. So they're taking a lot longer. So that's not necessarily indicative of how they're all going to come out, but it is a telling statistic, I think. And so I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. I've been talking way too much at this point.
I'm just trying to be mindful of our time.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we should, because I just giving a quick status of, okay, well, this was the result of the big picture, and we have to play the little kitty cat video, so. This is what happened to Florida permit applicants after, a district court vacated the 404 program.
Yeah, in case you weren't aware, we had a state 404 program assumed in 2020 under the old rule, and in 2024, the district court vacated the program in its entirety, did not stay it, and that's currently on appeal. So DEP was issuing the 404 permits for a while, and it was a big mess to get them to DEP. It was a big mess to send them back.
Yep. In 2 weeks' time for Q&A, we'll just kind of sum it all up that currently the Corps has sole permitting authority for 404 permits in Florida, but the Corps has outsourced some of that permitting authority to other district offices, not just the Jacksonville district, what they call the Big Picture Program Delivery Team. And then also a private company is handling some permit applications. They've outsourced it to SES Group. I'm gonna skip that. Anything else, Susan, on the 404?
Yeah, I would just say that when they are outsourcing, they are outsourcing based on capacity. So they're sending a lot of our wetland permit applications to states that don't have, just districts that don't really have any wetlands. So the learning curve is probably going to be a little steep, but they've stated that they're only sending the simpler. Most applications for wetland permits here are for nationwide permits that are the smaller threshold or under 5 acres or less. And those are the kinds that they say that they're sending those over, and that they have this vacature delivery team to kind of coordinate everything, and they're keeping the more complex ones in-house. And I think the important point, and Victoria, I'd like, you touched on this a little bit, is the state environmental resource permitting program is completely unaffected by all of this. The state has its own wetland permitting program that also folds in stormwater management at the same time. They've done it for years. They don't care whether it's isolated or connected or anything. If it's an upland cut ditch or a wetland cut ditch, they may tell you you don't need mitigation for the upland cut ditch, but it still has to be permitted, and its effects on water, downstream water resources has to be evaluated. None of that is getting affected. And there's a new EPA just issued in December a new rule on how you get program assumption. They really want to encourage tribes to do it. None of tribes have done it, and New Jersey and Michigan are the only states that have 404. Florida has stated it's going to keep trying. We'll see. And I guess, Victoria, what do you see in terms of what do we see as clients doing now that it's back? Because I know what my clients are doing. Instead of going,
Yeah, so like you said, in 2020, when the Corps transferred about 500 permits to FDEP, it was a learning curve. And a lot of the reviewers, the environmental consultants were educating the reviewers. And they thought it would streamline the process, because why not have one reviewer do ERP and 404? But the next 4 years were hard. But we finally got there. We finally were on a roll. And then all of a sudden, last February, everything came to a halt. Nobody had any idea that this was going to happen. I remember when I first found out, I started messaging everyone and anyone I knew that was in my phone, and they all said, "This is fake news." I said, "No, it's not fake news." And so this has really created a lot of uncertainty and more time, because now they had to transfer over 1,500 permits back to the Corps, and they said, "Don't worry, we're going to leave off where we left with your permitting over at FDP." Not at all. They've all had to start over, and so the permitting timelines have been so significantly delayed on projects from restoration from the Everglades to multifamily homes, to schools, to firehouses, whatever you can think of. And so it's so important to understand that going back and forth is not in our favor at all. But like Susan said, Florida is still trying to get back to assume 404 so that we can take it away from the Corps and regulate both 404 and ERP at the same time. However, as of today, they are back to the way they used to be. State is ERP, environmental resource permit for isolated wetlands and jurisdictional wetlands, and then the POR overlaps with it for jurisdictional wetlands as well with the 404 program. But to figure out if you need a 404 program or not is still a little unclear, and a jurisdictional determination is required. Fill out a form, wait back, 6 months to find out if you need to apply. So lots of frustration on the environmental consultants and landowner, developer side, and so we wait.
Well, I think we are out of time. I don't know if we have any time for questions. You have to tell me if we have time for
Go
questions.
ahead
Okay.
for about 5 minutes.
Right.
Do you expect new guidance from the federal agencies anytime soon?
Well, we're seeing it in the memos that have been coming out of headquarters on how they're interpreting it. They don't seem to have really internalized that Sharpie decision for Florida or some of the other court decisions. They've internalized that White decision that said that it doesn't need to be indistinguishable. So it's trickling out. There will be something, I very much suspect the conforming rules are going to get repealed again. They're going to go through that whole effort again and cause us more, like my clients just want certainty. Because we're in Florida, everything's regulated anyway. They're just like, just tell us, right? Just tell us what rules apply and who's going to be issuing the permits. So, in the black.
Thanks. So since this is a public interest environmental conference and not a regulated industry conference, could you just share with the audience the part that you sort of skipped over because of time about the key difference in why the rule was vacated, specifically the interaction with other federal safeguards that are not applicable at the state level, like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act?
Yeah, the vacatur was based entirely on Endangered Species Act grounds. Endangered Species Act prohibits the take of a endangered species without appropriate without a permit. There are two ways to get that authorization. One is through after consultation between federal agencies, and that's called Section 7 consultation. And that's what you always got in the Section 404 permit when it was issued by the Corps. The other is Section 10, and that's private applicant driven, and that is a more involved and time-intensive process, requires publication in the Federal Register and all of that. And so, and the other programs that they have assumption, and that's what has, and then you also have to prove no impacts to illicit species as part of your permitting criteria under the 404B1 guidelines for a federal 404 permit, and that applies to whoever's running it. But all of that requirement you can't confer with a federal agency, you can't trigger Section 7 if the state's running the program. And so, so what they did at the state level, New Jersey and Michigan just don't have the listed species that we have in Florida, and so they kicked that. They just said that's case by case. If you need a federal permit to impact that because you might harm a species, just go do it when you need it. And what they wanted was more certainty, and so they tried to do it on a programmatic basis. And on that programmatic basis, they couldn't say how many species, they couldn't say how much habitat because it was programmatic. What they did say was if the applicant accepts every single permit condition that the federal and the state wildlife agencies put in your permit, then that will be protected. And it actually was reasonably protected. There were more listed species permits in my client's state 404 permits than I'd ever seen in either the ERP or the federal 404 permit. But that was the basis. The court said, that's not what Section 7 requires. It requires more specificity, and you didn't have the specificity, so that programmatic approach you took, you can't take, so they vacated it. NEPA is also something that's interaction with just between federal agencies, and that is something that can only happen between federal agencies. And so that doesn't happen in any of the state programs. That happens in the state programs. They look at that at a programmatic level already. Like Florida already implements all federal, EPA environmental, programs on behalf of EPA except this one. 404 is the only one that it doesn't do. I think maybe there's some, Oil Pollution Act stuff that EPA does as well that's like shipping related. But they, you know, it's not uncommon. This is the only one that has weird on what, you know, it's got that section 7 component with listed species, and it has weird components about how many waters they can assume and not. And so this is the only one where they have not assumed the program. And you know, some states just don't have the resources, but Florida has always assumed as many of the programs as it can historically. In the hat?
Yeah, so since we don't have a typical year anymore, since this is the climate conference, where does that take you?
And that is one of the things that is super, super up in the air. Like the courts have said, if it's seasonally continuous, it's still jurisdictional. What does that mean? Like they have a whole antecedent and I think we'll still see that. They use this antecedent, and I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know what that means, but the antecedent precipitation tool, APT, they use that. And I have clients where we have flow gauges, and they go in and they start, because we do these, you know, clients, we're doing these things many in advance. It takes multiple years to get through. So they're going out there and getting flow data on all their streams. Because in Florida, you got streams that are like this big, and then you got, you know, and so that is definitely changing, because they got waters that, I mean, things are gonna flow a lot more than they used to, for sure.
We have time for about one more question.
In black, sorry,
My question is for Ms. Bruce. You mentioned the idea of sort of clients wanting regularity with what the law is, and now that it's shifted back to the Army Corps to issue these permits, which has been the long-standing way permits are handled, how do your clients feel about the fact that the state is now trying to, you know, get that authority back? Does that feel like more uncertainty to them?
Absolutely. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone knows what exactly, you know, who wants which regulatory agency, either the FDEP or the Corps. They don't really care who regulates it. Let's just make a decision and let's do it efficiently. You know, because going back and forth is just creating unnecessary time delays, where this permitting process is, with 404, is already a very stringent, long process. Before this issue, it probably takes 3 to 6 months.
for mitigation bank.
No,
yeah.
we're looking at wetland impacts. Now we're looking at, that's another story, that's 7 years.
Yeah.
Wetland impacts are more like, you know, 6 months to a year now, because we're starting all over. So as far as going back to FDEP, I don't think anyone really has a game in the hunt. They just really want them to figure it out. I know that them trying to repeal it because of the endangered species. There's only so many projects that have that issue, and so there's some different out of the box thinking that can happen if it does go back to Florida, so that they can assume Army Corps of Engineers could assume some of the endangered species projects. But who knows what will happen? Hopefully we'll get some more notice before, you know, last time in February they did it in the middle of the night. And so we wait to find out if there'll be any other changes, or if we continue going on with the Army Corps of Engineers in Florida.